My friends, as you step into the threshold of a new year, you must understand that time itself is never truly linear. It spirals, it folds, it returns us to the places where our souls once trembled, and then it asks, will you meet this moment with the same wounded patterns, or will you rise as the one who finally sees the full architecture of the psyche? When I say that 2026 belongs to the empath who confronts the narcissist and the family pain that created them both, I am not speaking of a social trend or a cultural shift, but of a psychic inevitability that has been forming in the collective unconscious for decades. You are stepping into a year that will demand a confrontation with the shadow, not merely the shadow of others, but the shadow that lives in the hallways of your childhood, in the emotional atmosphere of your home, in the unspoken rules that shaped your identity long before you ever met the narcissist who mirrored your deepest wounds. You see, every empath who finds themselves entangled with a narcissist is not meeting an enemy. They are meeting an echo, a figure resurrected from the earliest chapters of their life, from the tension they carried in their body, long before they learned language. A narcissist does not simply appear in adulthood. They are summoned by the unfinished grief of the inner child, by the subconscious drive to recreate what was familiar, even if what was familiar was painful. And this is the paradox the empath must face in 2026, that the narcissist who wounded them in adulthood was not the origin of their suffering, but the reflection of the very pain they once adapted to in order to survive the emotional climate of their family. I have always said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Many empaths interpret their compassion as a gift, but the truth is more mysterious. For countless empaths, their sensitivity was not born from serenity, it was forged in emotional chaos. They developed the ability to feel everything, because feeling everything was the only way to stay safe. They learned to anticipate the storm before it erupted, to read micro-expressions like sacred texts, to sense shifts in tone as if their survival depended on it. And indeed, it did. The empath learned early that attunement was protection. Hypervigilance masqueraded as intuition. Peace was a luxury they rarely tasted. This was the origin of the empath's extraordinary capacity, the need to adapt to the unpredictability of the people they depended on. But 2026 brings something different. It brings a psychic turning point, a year when the empath is no longer content with managing the emotional weather of others. They are beginning to ask with an almost spiritual urgency, what about my weather? What about the storms inside me? Instead of directing their sensitivity outward, they are feeling a magnetic pull to turn it inward. This is the beginning of individuation, the soul's insistence that we stop living as the extension of someone else's wounds and start living as the embodiment of our own wholeness. You may wonder why this confrontation must involve the narcissist. Why does the empath transformation always seem to pass through the terrain of someone who manipulates, distorts, and drains? It is because the narcissist is not merely a person They are an archetype. They represent the unintegrated shadow of the empath. Everything the empath has denied in themselves, where the empath bends, the narcissist demands, where the empath self-sacrifices, the narcissist self-inflates. Where the empath avoids conflict, the narcissist manufactures it. They are psychic opposites, drawn together with the force of myth, because it is through this polarity that each reveals what the other has hidden from themselves. This is why their connection feels fated, electric, impossible to simply walk away from. It has the energy of an ancient reenactment. The empath sees the wounded child behind the narcissist's rage, believing they are the one who can finally soothe it. But this is where the great misunderstanding lies. The empath is not there to heal the narcissist. The narcissist is there to reveal the empath's own wound. The wound they could never acknowledge in their family system, because doing so would have shattered their sense of belonging. And here we must finally speak of the family. For everything that happens in adulthood is merely the unfolding of what was initiated in childhood. The narcissist in your life is not the first person who made you responsible for the emotions of others. They are not the first person whose approval you believed you had to earn through self-erasure. They are not the first person who punished your boundaries, rewarded your compliance, or mistook your gentleness for duty. The narcissist is the reenactment of a family pattern so old it became invisible. But 2026 is the year the invisible becomes unbearable to ignore. So many empaths are awakening now, not because they suddenly learned psychology, but because their soul refuses to tolerate the same emotional burdens it once carried with silence. There is a deep cosmic shift pulling the empath toward truth, a truth that disrupts the peace they tried so hard to maintain. They are beginning to question the narratives their families handed them, those unspoken instructions that shape the architecture of their identity. Be good, be quiet, be understanding, be strong for others, be the one who keeps the harmony. These were not virtues, they were survival strategies, and they were costly. They taught the empath that love must be earned, that emotional stability is their responsibility, and that their own needs are negotiable while others' needs are sacred. But here is the revelation. The empath's conflict with the narcissist is not a conflict between two adults, it is the return of the original conflict between the child and the emotional dysfunction of the family. The narcissist becomes the teacher who reveals what the empath's family never allowed them to name that love. Without reciprocity is not love. That loyalty without boundaries is enslavement. And that compassion without self-regard is a slow form of self-abandonment. In 2026, the empath confronts not only the narcissist in front of them, but the emotional blueprint behind them. They begin to recognize that their instinct to fix, soothe, forgive, and understand was not spiritual maturity, it was emotional adaptation. It was the child's attempt to survive in a family where their needs were too heavy, their feelings too overwhelming, their voice too disruptive. The empath became the stabilizer, the peacekeeper, the invisible one who held the emotional glue of the household. But this role was not chosen. It was assigned, and now the psyche is demanding its release. Many empaths experience this awakening as a kind of internal earthquake. What once felt noble now feels exhausting. What once felt compassionate now feels self-betraying. What once felt destined now feels karmic, something to be resolved, not repeated. The soul begins to whisper that the time for unconscious loyalty has ended. This is the year the empath stops absorbing the pain of others and begins to transmute their own. The year they stop choosing partners, friends, and roles that echo their childhood wounds. The year they realize that their ability to feel deeply is not a burden, but a compass pointing toward their own liberation. But liberation always begins with one moment, the moment the empath finally sees the narcissist. Clearly, not through the lens of hope, not through the lens of potential, but through the lens of psychological truth. They see that the narcissist's behavior was never about them, that the blame they internalized was a projection, that the guilt they carried was inherited, and that the love they offered was devoured by someone who could not perceive it. This clarity ruptures the spell. It breaks the psychic contract that bound them to reenact the past. It allows them to confront not with aggression but with consciousness. And what does confrontation look like for the empath in 2026? It is not a battle, not a dramatic explosion, not an emotional war. It is a shift in identity. It is the quiet declaration: I will no longer abandon myself for the comfort of others. It is the refusal to play the role that family dynamics carved into their psyche. It is the courage to let the narcissist face their own emptiness instead of offering themselves as the container for it. It is the profound psychological act of stepping out of the archetype of the healer and reclaiming the archetype of the self. This is where the empath's power begins, not in saving others, but in returning to the fragments of themselves they left behind in childhood. As they do, the narcissist loses their gravitational pull, family patterns unravel, and the empath begins, for the first time, to experience freedom, not as escape, but as embodiment. And as we continue, I want you to feel not only the logic of these truths, but their vibration within your own unconscious, because nothing I say here is truly new. It is ancient knowledge resurfacing. You already know this story, not because you learned it, but because you lived it. The patterns you repeat in adulthood are not random selections. They are the echoes of psychic imprints formed in the earliest years of your life. Every empath carries within them the ghost of a child who learned to read tension the way others learned to read books. That child still lives inside you, observing, analyzing, absorbing, anticipating. The empath's adult sensitivity is the continuation of that early vigilance, carried like a torch through the corridors of time. But there comes a moment, often subtle, often unexpected, when the adult psyche can no longer sustain the burden of the child's adaptations. This moment is what 2026 symbolizes in the collective unconscious. A year in which the empath becomes aware of the discrepancy between their emotional skill and their emotional freedom. The empath has learned to understand others better than they understand themselves. They have learned to soothe storms they did not create. They have learned to love without the expectation of being loved in return. But now the soul insists on a correction, a rebalancing, a turning inward. The empath is being summoned to retrieve the self they once abandoned in service of the emotional needs of others. When you confront a narcissist, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity, you are not confronting a single person. You are confronting the entire architecture of your childhood conditioning. You are facing the internalized belief that your worth is measured by how much you can endure, how much you can fix, how much you can tolerate. The narcissist simply brings these beliefs to the surface with such intensity that you can no longer ignore them. They expose the wound you thought had healed simply because you learned to live with it. But adaptation is not healing, and survival is not wholeness. Many empaths carry a dream they never speak aloud, the dream of being understood without having to explain, of being held without having to earn it, of being loved without having to shrink themselves into acceptability. But this dream cannot be fulfilled until the empath releases the unconscious loyalty they still carry toward their family of origin. And this is where the awakening becomes painful, because the empath often protects the very people who wounded them. They preserve the myth of the loving family even when their childhood was shaped by emotional neglect, unpredictability, guilt, obligation, or silent resentment. The psyche protects the image of the parent long after it stops protecting the child. And it is this conflict, the collision of loyalty and truth, that the narcissist brings into the present. When the narcissist devalues the empath, blames them, criticizes them, withdraws affection, or punishes them for having needs, it reactivates the old family wound. But this reactivation is not a curse, it is a portal. Behind the narcissist stands the mother who could not regulate her emotions, the father who projected his frustration onto the sensitive child, the sibling who demanded attention, the household atmosphere where the empath learned that love comes with conditions. This is why the confrontation feels so intense, so destabilizing, so disproportionate. You are not reacting to one person. You are reacting to a lineage of emotional dynamics that have shaped your identity for decades. But to confront is not to attack. To confront means to see without distortion, without hope, without fear, without projection. To see the narcissist not as a monster, but as a mirror that reveals your own forgotten boundaries, your own suppressed anger, your own unmet needs, your own inner child pleading to be acknowledged. The narcissist becomes the figure that forces you to recognize where your empathy has become self-betrayal. They show you the cost of compassion without discernment. They show you the danger of loving without reciprocity. They show you the consequences of carrying emotional burdens that were never meant to be yours. And something extraordinary happens when the empath sees this clearly. The narcissist loses their power, not because the empath becomes stronger in the traditional sense, but because the empath stops participating in the unconscious dance. They stop explaining themselves. They stop absorbing blame. They stop accepting distorted realities. They stop offering endless compassion to someone who cannot meet them in the same emotional universe. They stop allowing their worth to be defined by someone else's emptiness, and in that moment, the empath experiences a psychological rupture, a break from the past, so profound that it feels like stepping into another timeline. This is why 2026 belongs to them, because the empath no longer sees themselves as the healer of others, but as the guardian of their own soul. You must understand the archetypal forces at play. The empath and the narcissist are not merely individuals. They are mythological opposites. One represents the inflating mask, the false self built on admiration and control. The other represents the dissolving self, the porous boundaries that merge into the emotions of others. When these two forces collide, a third thing emerges: the possibility of transformation. For the narcissist, the confrontation brings collapse because their identity cannot withstand the absence of control. But for the empath, the confrontation brings awakening because their identity has always been built on connection, not domination. When they reclaim their self, they do not shrink, they expand. This expansion feels like remembering something you have forgotten for a very long time. It feels like exhaling after years of holding your breath. It feels like standing at the center of your own life for the first time. You begin to sense that your compassion is not a weakness, it is a power, misdirected. You begin to understand that your sensitivity is not fragility, it is perception sharpened by survival. You begin to witness how deeply you have misunderstood yourself. The empath was never too much. They were simply never allowed to exist fully, and now the psyche is pushing them to emerge, to step out of the role they once believed was their destiny. The strangest part of this awakening is that it often brings grief, not because you are losing the narcissist, but because you are losing the fantasy that kept you bonded to them, the fantasy that if you love enough, everything will change. The fantasy that if you are patient enough, they will finally see you. The fantasy that if you sacrifice enough, you will earn the safety you never had as a child. But fantasies dissolve when confronted by truth, and this dissolution is painful but liberating. It allows the empath to finally meet reality, not as an enemy, but as a guide. When the empath confronts the narcissist, something shifts, not only externally but internally. The inner child finally sees an adult version of themselves who can speak truth, set boundaries, hold the line, and walk away if necessary. This is the healing the inner child waited decades to receive, not through theories, not through affirmations, but through the lived experience of witnessing the adult self-reclaim authority. This moment is what heals the original wound. Because the wound was never about the narcissist in adulthood, it was about the child who was never protected, never validated, never claimed. Now they are finally being claimed, not by others, but by you. And as this internal alignment takes place, the world around the empath begins to change. Relationships that were once draining lose their grip. Connections built on imbalance unravel. Patterns that felt fated suddenly feel optional. The empath discovers they no longer seek intensity, but stability. No longer crave validation, but resonance. No longer chase love, but recognize it. The landscape of the psyche transforms from a battlefield into a sanctuary, and this transformation radiates into the outer world, drawing new people, new opportunities, new identities into their orbit. The empath begins to embody a truth they once heard but never believed. Healing is not becoming who you were before the wound, it is becoming who you were always meant to be beyond it. Their sensitivity becomes wisdom, their intuition becomes discernment, their compassion becomes strength, and their boundaries becomes a sacred architecture through which their true nature can finally emerge. This is why 2026 is not just another year, it is a rite of passage, a turning of the inner wheel, a doorway through which the empath steps not as the caretaker of others, but as the sovereign of their own inner world. They carry with them not bitterness, but clarity, not fear, but consciousness, not trauma, but transformation. And so as we move deeper into the current of this revelation, I want you to feel the subtle shift occurring within your own psyche. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with fireworks or dramatic proclamations. It arrives like dawn quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. The empath awakening is not a single moment, but a gradual alchemy, the dissolving of an old identity and the emergence of a new one. The empath who enters 2026 is not the same person who walked through the previous years carrying everyone else's sorrow like a sacred burden. They are beginning to sense something revolutionary, that their story does not need to be built around the emotional needs of others, that they, too, are worthy of the tenderness they so freely give, that the love they have poured outward may now be poured inward without guilt. But before this transformation completes, there is an essential passage. The empath must walk through a symbolic descent into the underworld of their own unconscious, a confrontation, not with the narcissist alone, but with the archetypal patterns that have orchestrated their relationships since childhood. If you close your eyes for a moment, you may feel it, a particular heaviness, a familiar ache, a memory of being small in a world that demanded you be large. This ache is a remnant of an ancient dynamic. The empath's original role in the family system, the one who understood too much too early, the one who absorbed the tensions adults refused to name, the one who was praised for being mature, calm, helpful, intuitive, while internally carrying wounds that adults were too distracted, too overwhelmed, or too wounded themselves to notice. You were not seen, but you saw everything. You were not heard, but you heard everything. You were not held, but you held everything. And because you learned to do this so well, the pattern followed you into adulthood, shaping the partnerships you entered, the friends you chose, the roles you accepted, the burdens you carried. Without question, this is why the empath's entanglement with the narcissist feels like destiny. It repeats the emotional blueprint carved into your psyche long before you had the power to resist it. But destiny is not a prison, it is a message. And once the message is understood, the pattern loses its power. That is what 2026 represents: the understanding, a sacred recognition that the empath's sensitivity was never meant to be a lifelong contract of emotional servitude. It was meant to be a doorway into consciousness, the beginning of a journey toward individuation, the emergence of the self from the constraints of the persona. When the empath confronts the narcissist, something extraordinary happens, not only in the external relationship, but within the psyche itself. The shadow begins to speak. The parts of you that were suppressed in order to maintain peace in your childhood begin to rise. The anger you silenced, the boundaries you never learned to express, the grief you carried in your bones, the longing you buried because it felt too dangerous to reveal, all of these elements awaken as if stirred by some ancient code. And this awakening may feel chaotic, overwhelming, even frightening, because the empath has long equated calm with safety, quiet with love, compliance with belonging. But now the psyche is asking for truth, not the performance of harmony, but the authenticity of emotional reality. You begin to see that your anger is not destructive, it is protective. You begin to feel that your boundaries are not punishment, they are self-respect. You begin to understand that your grief is not weakness, it is the soul's way of cleansing itself of the past. And this inner expansion creates a psychic force that the narcissist cannot manipulate, cannot distort, cannot control. This is why the narcissist reacts with such intensity when the empath awakens. They feel the shift. They sense that the source of validation, admiration, and emotional fuel they once relied on is no longer available. And their panic is the clearest sign that you are reclaiming your power. But this confrontation is not about defeating the narcissist. It is about no longer defeating yourself. It is about recognizing the ways you have abandoned your own needs, your own desires, your own truth, in order to maintain relationships that were never reciprocal. It is about acknowledging that your empathy when distorted into self-sacrifice, becomes a prison disguised as virtue. And yet, beneath the layers of guilt and obligation, there is a deeper truth waiting to be reclaimed. You deserve the same gentleness you give. This truth is not easy for the empath to accept, because their identity has long been shaped around the belief that they must earn love by giving more than they receive. But 2026 challenges this belief at its core. It calls the empath into a new archetype, not the healer, not the caretaker, but the sovereign, the one who does not seek permission to exist, the one who does not shrink to avoid conflict, the one who does not dissolve to maintain someone else's psychological comfort, the one who stands fully in their truth, even when others misunderstand it. To reach this state, the empath must revisit the symbolic landscape of their childhood, not to dwell, not to blame, but to understand. Imagery often arises in dreams during this phase: a dimly lit hallway, a closed door, a voice calling from another room, a storm outside the window, or the feeling of being both child and adult at once. These dreams are not random. They are the psyche's way of guiding the empath back to the original wound, the wound of invisibility, the wound of emotional responsibility that should never have been theirs, the wound of carrying love like a duty instead of a birthright. When these dreams surface, pay attention. They are the unconscious revealing where the story began, so you may at last decide where it ends. And this decision is the empath's greatest turning point. When they choose to break the pattern, something remarkable unfolds. The narcissist loses the psychic dominance they once held. The family's unspoken demands no longer dictate the empath's identity. The old roles crumble, the silent expectations dissolve, and the empath steps out of the generational shadow as if stepping from night into day. They begin to sense an inner spaciousness. They have never known a space where their own desires, preferences, and boundaries can finally breathe. This inner spaciousness becomes the birthplace of a new life. Relationships begin to feel less like negotiations and more like mutual presence. Friendships begin to align with authenticity rather than obligation. Love begins to take the shape of reciprocity rather than sacrifice. And the empath discovers, often with awe, that the world does not fall apart when they stop holding everything together. This realization is one of the most profound psychological transitions a human being can experience. It marks the beginning of true individuation, because individuation is not the pursuit of perfection, it is the reclamation of the self from the archetypes and roles imposed upon you. And for the empath, this reclamation is revolutionary. It dismantles decades of unconscious conditioning. It interrupts generational cycles. It awakens a new lineage of consciousness in the family system. By healing themselves, the empath heals the past and reshapes the future. That is the magnitude of the work you are doing. As this transformation deepens, the empath begins to embody a paradoxical truth the more they care for themselves. The more powerful their empathy becomes, not as a tool of survival, but as an expression of selfhood. Their intuition becomes clearer because it is no longer clouded by the need to anticipate danger. Their compassion becomes purer because it is no longer driven by guilt. Their emotional insight becomes sharper because it is no longer entangled with a desire to fix others. They evolve from the wounded empath into the conscious empath, one who feels deeply without absorbing, who loves fully without losing themselves, who sees clearly without collapsing into the pain of others. This is the empath who emerges in 2026, the one who is no longer defined by their suffering but by their sovereignty. The one who does not fear the narcissist's anger or their silence or their disapproval because they have reclaimed the authority over their own emotional world. The one who can walk away not in bitterness but in clarity. The one who can look at their past without being trapped by it. The one who chooses relationships not from wounds but from wisdom. And as this new identity crystallizes, the empath realizes something that echoes through the deepest chambers of the soul. The confrontation was never a battle. It was a rebirth, a return to the self that had been waiting beneath the layers of obligation, guilt, and adaptation. A return to the original essence from which their empathy was born, not fear, but connection, not survival, but truth, not pain, but presence. This is why the year belongs to them, not because the world changes, but because they change, and when an empath changes from the inside out, the entire structure of their life rearranges to match their new vibration. This is the power of consciousness. This is the destiny unfolding. And now, as we move into the deepest layer of this journey, I want you to sense the gravity of what is unfolding within you. This is no longer a discussion about personalities or relationships. What you are encountering now is the architecture of your psyche, the subterranean world that has been shaping your destiny long before consciousness ever caught up. When the empath reaches this stage of awakening, something extraordinary occurs. They stop looking outward for explanations and begin listening to the voice that has been whispering in the shadows of their soul since childhood. This voice is not dramatic. It is not loud. It feels ancient, like a memory from a life you barely remember living. It speaks in truths that are so clear they almost frighten you, because they contradict everything you were taught to believe about love, family, loyalty, and selfhood. This voice belongs to the self, not the persona, not the role, not the adaptive identity, but the eternal core of your being. And the self asks only one thing, that you return. Return from the emotional labyrinths where you have been wandering. Return from the identities you adopted to stay safe. Return from the wounds you mistook for destiny. Return from the people who mirrored your childhood pain more than your adult potential. Return from the narcissistic bond that felt like fate but was actually a reenactment. Return from the family narratives that taught you sacrifice was the price of belonging. Return to yourself, but to return, you must pass through the threshold of truth, not the gentle truth of comforting insight, but the stark truth of psychological illumination, the kind that dissolves illusions like fire dissolves fog. This is why confronting the narcissist feels like standing before a mirror made of lightning. Everything you refuse to acknowledge becomes visible. Everything you avoided becomes unavoidable.